At the end of the day, there's nothing really intrinsically redeeming about anime. I mean, no more than any other type of media. They're ultimately just TV shows from Japan. That said, the meta-genre has some unique forms and story templates that are either uncommon or functionally non-existent in Western media, and that's worth singling anime out for exploration. It's a pulpy format, often cheaply made, heavy on formula, low on critical respect, and low on scrutiny. It's that last note that's important, though. I'll have to explain what I really mean by that. A TV show like Two and a Half Men or a Disney film like The Lion King, those are highly scrutinized. For marketability, just in case you were worried it was artistic scrutiny. A lot of money and reputation is at stake, so the authors end up surrounded by circles of lawyers, image managers, network executives, studio executives, marketers, and the bosses of all of those people, all taking stake in the product. The shows are workshopped and focus grouped, consultants are brought in, and in the end there are a lot of people who are paying attention to what's going on in order to make sure that the end product serves their ultimate goal of making a boatload of cash. That's why we talk about animators sneaking things past the censors. Pulpy formats, on the other hand, no one really cares about, at least not in specific. There are still stakeholders involved, but they tend to be more concerned with the overall package than any given piece. So long as you're hitting the main selling points of the formula, you're golden. Does your romance novel have a vulnerable heroine with a heaving bosom? Does it have a dark stranger with a mysterious past, rippling pecs, and a heart of gold? Then fine, do whatever the hell you want else with it. This lack of oversight, combined with, let's face it, generally low expectations, both of the audience and from the audience, make pulp formats one of the best places for authors to explore in. Arthur C. Clarke, H.P. Lovecraft, film noir, and most of our modern comic book superheroes have their roots in low-grade pulp. Indie games and webcomics would be the newest comparable formats. All of these pulpy formats have the same thing in common: tons and tons of forgettably low-grade crap with the occasional piece that experiments in a way that just works. The quantity over quality approach gives a lot of different people opportunities to push something out there. It gives them opportunities to fail, to learn, and if they're willing to try, to innovate. The barriers for entry are low and turnover is high. Anime isn't all that different. The vast majority is forgettable formula crap that, at best, feigns some maudlin depth. But there's also some really interesting, really inventive, really funny, really resonant, and really charming stuff being made. And with that preamble, let's talk about Neon Genesis Evangelion, The End of Evangelion. To start, The End of Evangelion is one of the greatest troll moments in modern history. So, let's talk about it. The End of Evangelion is reductio ad absurdum, a reduction to the absurd, but that doesn't really do it credit. It is Hideaki Anno standing naked atop a mountain at dawn, dick flapping in the wind as he gives the double deuce action to an ocean of fanboys. The film itself is okay, has some interesting artistic merits, and makes some narrative choices that bear discussion, but all of that pales in comparison to the discussion about the story surrounding the film. At this point, the story has been worked over so many times that it's practically myth, but I like this mythology, both because it reinforces my worldview, and because it's entertaining. First, we have to talk about the show and how the show actually ended. Neon Genesis Evangelion is a combination, subversion, and evolution of the giant fighting robot genre of anime. As the name of the genre implies, giant fighting robot shows typically revolve around giant robots that fight. The roots of the genre go all the way back to the 50s with Tetsuan 28 Go, known in English countries as Gigantor or Iron Man 28, but audiences are far more familiar with shows like Macross, Gundam, or the Japanese-American co-production Robotech, which is itself a spin-off / mutation of Macross and has its own all-American child in the MechWarrior franchise. Evangelion starts off ordinary enough, if a little bleak, but the first 10 episodes are more or less rote giant fighting robot stuff. The only thing sort of innovative was the odd design of the robots as somewhat horrific organic machine hybrids, and a heavy injection of Christian mythology and symbology which added a distinct supernatural element that was, at the least, a bit unique. Actually, small tangent here, just because it's interesting but doesn't really pay off anywhere else. The use of Christian mythology is often touted by a chunk of the Western fanbase as a dense and obtuse metaphor, a deeply rooted commentary and criticism of metaphysics. The reality is that the predominantly Shinto, Buddhist, Japanese authors of Evangelion use Christianity in the same way that we use Norse and Roman mythology.
Your power! I cast you out!
Back on track, after episode 10 things started to shift, with less and less time per episode being spent dealing with the monster of the week, and then around episode 16 things really changed. Deeply. The root causes were both scheduling changes made within the studio that significantly reduced the time given to create each episode, and the sarin gas attack on the Tokyo subway system in March 1995 that compelled Anno to drop a chunk of completed work that resembled the real-life event. Actually, I feel like I need to expand a little bit more on why Gainax was willing to adjust their course following the attacks. Unfortunately, the events were a little bit more than superficial in their similarities. The attack on the Tokyo subway system was perpetrated by a doomsday cult that drew heavily on Christian imagery and mythology. In fact, the entire purpose of the attack in their minds was to hasten the oncoming apocalypse. Given that Evangelion also features a shadowy government group seeking to bring about the end of the world by initiating the apocalypse, I don't really blame Gainax for getting a little bit gun-shy. These sudden changes applied a ton of pressure and left big voids that needed to be filled at a time when everyone was desperate to have a product shipping out the door. Two other ingredients to add to the stew. Anno had spent at least 4 years prior to the production of Evangelion in a state of deep depression, and during the production he had become increasingly disenchanted with the otaku or hyperfan lifestyle. The final 10 episodes of Evangelion, and by extension the entire show, due to how these episodes reframe the early narrative, are a story about depression, the critical role of self-acceptance and identity, and the toxic nature of obsession and fixation. Through the show, the writers demonstrate, often in harsh and abrasive ways, that no one can really rely on others for their self-identity. Friends, colleagues, authority figures, the government, your job, even lovers and family, none of them are a replacement for self-worth because at the end of the day, other people have their own things to worry about. Shinji's life is an unending cascade of failures that drive home this point. The one thing that Shinji wants most in his life is validation of who he is as a person, and one by one these things are taken away from him. No matter how hard he tries to impress his father remains distant. His friendships and work relationships often let him down, if he's not outright robbed of them. His job betrays him, and the status that he gets from being important ultimately makes him a target and becomes a liability. In the end, Shinji is stripped of everything. This is represented literally and figuratively by the end of the world. The last 2 episodes of the series revolve around the end of the world and the transformative process that Shinji goes through as he is finally locked away with nothing but himself and forced to confront his own existence. It's not until Shinji accepts who he is, that he is a thing that exists, and that existing is, on its own, power. It's not until he stops relying on the rest of the world to support his full weight, stops relying on the rest of the world to give him meaning, that these other relationships flow into existence. The explicit message of the show is that no one else can live your life for you. It's about making that breakthrough in recovering from depression where you realize that you have value and power over your own life, and that what you get from relationships is intrinsically tied to what you give. The message is that identity and acceptance are things that come from within and flow out into the world, not things that you can pull out of the world and cram inside. Relying on everyone else can work for a time, but it will never last because things happen. Other people have their own problems. They get sick, they die, they move away, their priorities change. You are the only person who will be there for every moment of your entire life. This message is presented somewhat abstractly through narrative, line animation, and montage, but it's actually quite effective at telling the story that it wants to tell. The lack of budget and time forced them to try something out of the box, and what they came up with meshes incredibly well with the overall message. I mean, let's take one specific example just to demonstrate. When Shinji has his epiphany that he wants to live, this force of personality, this change in perception, literally radiates outwards from him and redefines his experiential world as it passes. This ending about the end of the world, the one that ultimately focuses on the microcosmic spiritual salvation of the protagonist in a very direct and personal way, recontextualizes the preceding episodes in a way that elevates the show above every other action drama, and, aside from art direction, it is what ultimately makes Eva noteworthy. And fans hated it. They sent death threats to Anno. Like, actual death threats. They didn't want all this metaphor and meaning. They wanted giant robots. They wanted more Asuka being sexy. They wanted more fighting. They wanted more Rei being strange and aloof and sexy. They wanted Shinji, their avatar and surrogate, to get everything he ever wanted. They wanted more crazy, more pseudo-religious imagery, more about nerve and AT fields and instrumentality and seal. They wanted more. So Anno gave them more. He gave them a twisted perversion of everything they wanted. He took their entitled fanboyism and threw it right back in their faces in the least subtle way possible. Shinji masturbates to completion over Asuka's comatose body. And that's just the starting point. And with that, let's take another diversion. Auteur theory is a load of crap but still contains some valid observations in as much as the author is also the audience, effectively implying that creation is communication and not Aristotelian pedagogy. Personally, I think the auteur theory was drafted up by a bunch of prima donnas who just didn't like working with others. Great things are made by individuals, but they certainly don't have any sort of monopoly. Some people work well alone, some people work well in groups, and when it comes to meaning, in the end only audience remains. That said, content creators aren't totally out of the picture, and an artist's intent is worth perhaps $1 more than a random person's. But unless the narrative happens to grab onto some portion of conversation about intent and the back and forth between creators and audience, then all of that gets lost to the sands of time. Intent is useful trivia as a litmus test for the final product. There is debate about whether or not The End of Eva is revenge against the Ultra fans or not. Some defend the film as though this was the vision all along and the broadcast episodes were a deep compromise that everyone was unhappy with. That sounds like something said by someone who wasn't really paying attention. I mean, let's not sugarcoat this. Shinji masturbates to completion over Asuka's comatose body. Here's how it breaks down. On one hand, we have the broadcast ending of the show, which spends 2 episodes convincing the main character that he can only truly connect with the people around him, only truly achieve unity with everyone else, only become a productive and creative force in the universe once he has learned to take responsibility for existence, once he has decided that he wants to live. On the other hand, we have End of Eva, where the main character does nothing, learns nothing, realizes nothing, and accomplishes nothing. Well, he does masturbate to completion over Asuka's comatose body, so I guess he does have at least one climax. When presented with a choice, he rejects unity, rejects understanding, and rejects love. This is the polar opposite story. In fact, in the Evangelion mythos, there's something called an AT field, which is an absolute terror field. Don't worry about the specifics. The idea is that living things, meaning humanity, are individuals because their fear creates a barrier between their ego and everyone else's ego. Basically, it's my fear of being hurt that keeps me from truly, connecting with other people. What convinces Shinji to restart humanity in End of Evangelion isn't some notion that individuality is valuable and suffering allows us to appreciate great beauty, it's the notion that other people will feel fear again. He's so caught up in his own misery and pain that he just wants other people to suffer too. So the universe gives him Asuka back and he immediately tries to choke her to death, but he can't even do that because he's ultimately too weak and impotent in the universe to make any kind of meaningful decision. That's bleak. But I'll concede that it's messy, so let's break it out into 3 considerations. Consideration 1. The broadcast version is the intended capstone of the show. In Consideration 1, we end with a message about hope, self-acceptance, self-sacrifice, unity, and overcoming depression. The Evas and the Angels of the show become metaphors for the things in our lives that are just so much bigger than us that they seem almost unmanageable. In fact, the Evas themselves, revealed to be biological robots powered by the souls of the kids' dead parents, mostly their mothers. Are essentially a metaphor for adulthood. All kids are asked to grow into the legacy of their parents, which involves confronting and accepting both the good and the bad. Realizing that our parents are human too is a big step in maturing into adulthood, and when you're a teenager, it's kinda overwhelming and hard to comprehend. You have this fiery passion for life, but the world is still so much bigger than you. The angels are the adult problems that are going to get thrown your way whether you're prepared or not, and growing into adulthood is essentially a little more than confronting these problems and learning to pilot an adult body. Consideration 2. The End of Eva is the intended capstone of the show. In Consideration 2, we end with a story about a bleak failure of a human being confronted with challenges that he was not prepared for, could not cope with, and was ultimately crushed by. He is marginally aware of his own failings and immaturity, emotionally, physically, and sexually, but in the end is consumed by them and chooses to isolate himself from everyone else. When given what is ostensibly the object of his desire, he tries to destroy it because he is an irredeemable, ruined husk of a human being. Certainly a far darker character arc and a much bleaker story overall, but given the events that immediately precede both endings, where Shinji is forced to kill the one person in the world who loves him unconditionally, it really could go either way. Consideration 3. If Consideration 2 is true, does that prevent End of Eva from being revenge? You know what? No, it doesn't. It can be both at the same time. In essence, the question of whether or not End of Eva is revenge is separate from the question about the intended ending of the show, because the revenge elements can be isolated from the overall plot and events of the story. The revenge comes in the specifics. The major criticism of hyperfans stems from how their obsession over certain elements stunts their growth and narrows their vision. Let's not mince words, they tend to be sexual perverts. See, it's not about really liking something, it's about obsession and entitlement, and End of Eva injects both in spades. For one, Shinji masturbates to completion over Asuka's comatose body. I keep saying that because I want it to sink in, just how overt that is as a condemnation of the objectifying, possessive, and sexualized attitude megafans exhibit towards female characters. Fan service is practically a cornerstone of otaku culture, and this is no different in the North American equivalents, which is why I've just been saying megafan instead of otaku. Remember, Shinji is, was, and always will be the intended audience surrogate. The opening 10 episodes are practically by the numbers Magic Boy Pilot's giant robot story. He was the audience surrogate for the first 10 episodes, he was the audience surrogate for the following 16. Why should he stop now? Why would he stop now? At what point did he stop? The point where you started feeling icky about yourself? With that in mind, there's a specific sequence we should look at. At the 1 hour mark, the world effectively ends, or, well, is right on the cusp of ending, and Shinji's ego begins to dissolve. This begins a dissection of Shinji as a character, first dealing with his childish impulsiveness and abandonment issues in a vignette involving a sandcastle, and second dealing with his relationships with women. In an 8-minute long sequence, the female members of the cast run down Shinji in what can only be described as a brutal evisceration of his views on women, his jealousy, his possessiveness, and most of all, his unwillingness to take responsibility for his role in the relationships. The use of montage and selective framing in this sequence is brilliant. We are shown the world through Shinji's eyes, his gaze, his view of the women in his life, which is, for the most part, their breasts, neck, legs, and asses. Basically, every kind of fan service shot shows up here as a weapon of condemnation against the protagonist, because on one hand we are given his view of the world, but simultaneously he is confronted by the voices of the women he objectifies, and they bring him to task for this. He watches bitterly and disbelievingly as Misato has sex. She tells him to deal with it. Asuka tells him he'll never understand her, while Shinji focuses on her breasts and ass. He complains that she never talks to him, so how can he understand? Rei asks if he ever really tried to understand. He, of course, defends himself and insists that he did, then Asuka cuts right to the f***ing bone. I know all about your little jerk-off fantasies. So Shinji changes his tune and blames them. Why can't you be nice to me? They tell him they are nice to him, and he flips out. Shinji launches into a rant about how they're all just toying with him, hiding behind those smiles and keeping things ambiguous. Note that at this point, it's not even specific. The three women aren't even individualized, despite the very different relationships and conflicts that he has with each of them. To Shinji, they're just the objects of his sexual desire. When they say, "Hey, moron, Things about us are ambiguous because we've got our own crap to deal with. He complains about how that makes his life hard. In the last part of the sequence, he hones in on Asuka again and basically cries like a spoiled child. He insists that only she can help him. He needs her to love him. And here we go, with the grand summation of Shinji as a character and the condemnation of the audience through him as a surrogate. He doesn't need Asuka, anyone will do. He's only honed in on her because he's afraid of everyone else, unwilling to try, unwilling to grow, unwilling to love himself, and unwilling to accept what life brings him. She's got him there, really. He's full of self-loathing and he doesn't need her. Not specifically. He doesn't actually care about her. I mean, he did masturbate to completion over her comatose body, and that's just really difficult to defend. Lacking any ground to stand on, Shinji loses it. And then everyone melts into Tang. Okay, to wrap this all up, why do I care if End of Evangelion is, in whole or in part, revenge against the otaku that decried the ending of the show? Well, mostly because that's an interesting story on its own. It's modern folklore and creates some interesting variations in how you can approach and interpret the film. Namely, I like how it frames the relationship between authors and audience. An author's interpretation of their own work, in the widest scope of things, isn't much truer than anyone else's interpretation. But what if it's not just a conflict of interpretations? What if the process of creation is direct communication, conversation between author and audience? Anno both acknowledges and invites the audience to acknowledge the audience-author membrane as part of the movie itself. At one point, the film breaks the fourth wall and displays fan mail, both positive and negative, that was sent to Gainax, as well as vandalism on the Gainax studio entryway. They explicitly acknowledge, yes, we hear you. The two different endings to the show, the broadcast and the movie, give us two different visualizations of the same critical character moment with drastically different outcomes. Why the shift from a story of self-discovery to one of total failure? Why did Shinji's fate shift so dramatically? Well, Shinji is the audience surrogate. I guess we know what Anno thinks of his audience.